This dress is sophisticated and lovely, and I would never have considered sewing it if someone hadn't suggested it for the channel. If you have a pattern you'd like me to consider for the channel, become a channel member and let me know the pattern you're thinking of. I'll link the membership option in the description below. This pretty dress is the Birdie pattern by Seamwork. It features bow closures at the wrist, an elasticated waistline, and a full front button placket. This orange cream striped silk twill was perfect for the project. A lovely drape, nice and flowy. I made this dress today in a size 0. I shortened the sleeves by 1.5 inches at the length and shorten line, and I also shortened the front and back skirts and the placket at the adjustment lines by 4 inches. This affected the button placement, so I used my nifty button gauge at the end of the video for even spacing, and I'll link that tool below. Also, if you happen to be looking for a thread storage solution, I can recommend these wall sorters that I have 2 of in my sewing room, and I'll link those too. Now let's get started sewing the Birdie dress. Here is my back bodice piece, and I'm going to finish the raw edges of the shoulders separately. Doing this for the shoulder edges of the front pieces as well. Then I'll place my front and back bodice pieces right sides together and pin the shoulder seams. Sew both shoulder seams with a 5/8 inch seam allowance and press the seams open. Apply interfacing to the wrong side of each of your neckline facing pieces, then place them right sides together and pin the shoulders. Sew the facing shoulder seams with a 5/8 inch seam allowance and press them open. Now that the facing pieces are connected, finish the outer edges. Here are my front and back bodice pieces opened out at the shoulder seam, and I'm going to place the facing piece right sides together with the neckline and pin around the neckline matching the shoulder seams. Then I'll sew around the neckline with a 5/8 inch seam allowance. Now I'm going to trim this seam allowance and clip into the curves of the neckline. Now we're going to understitch the facing. We're going to turn the facing over its seam allowance and then stitch the facing to the seam allowance underneath all the way around the neckline with about 1/8 of an inch seam allowance. Once the facing is understitched, turn it to the inside of the garment and give that neckline a good press. Now along the center fronts, we're going to baste the bodice to its facing underneath, pinning the facing to the bodice and basting in place using the longest stitch on your machine and about 1/4 inch seam allowance. Here is the top of one of my sleeves. To prepare for placing the sleeve into the arm side later on, we're going to sew some basting stitches at the top of the sleeve cap, from one small dot to the other. Using the longest stitch on my machine, I'm going to leave thread tails on both ends and sew with about 1/4 inch seam allowance, sewing from small dot to small dot and doing this for both sleeves. Now that I have the top of the sleeve basted, we're going to move to the bottom of the sleeve. Using the slit guide on the pattern piece, I've gone ahead and cut the slit into the bottom of the sleeve. And I've also cut 1/4 inch wide double fold bias tape from my fabric. I'm going to place the bias tape and the bottom of the sleeve right sides together, opening up this slit so that it's a straight line, and then pinning the raw edge of the bias tape to the slit. Then we'll sew the bias tape from the bottom of one side of the slit to the bottom of the opposite side of the slit with about a 1/4 inch seam allowance, sewing slowly and carefully so that you don't catch any puckers in your stitches. Now here is the wrong side of the bottom of my sleeve with the bias tape attached. We want to take the opposite 1/4 inch pressed edge of the bias tape and fold it over the bias tape so that this new folded edge covers our original stitching line. And with those raw edges now enclosed, edge stitch close to that folded edge of the bias tape all the way along the slit. Now at the bottom of the sleeve, I'm going to cut off any excess bias tape. For the side of the bias tape that's closer to the sleeve's underarm seam, fold that bias tape so that the right side is on the wrong side of the sleeve fabric. And pin in place. We're going to be basting this end of the bias tape in place so that it stays to the inside of the garment. Then we're going to fold this slit right sides together and pin the bias tape together at the top of the slit. I'm going to sew this top edge of the slit's bias tape together, just sewing across that top edge to form a triangle. Repeat all of these steps to form the slit for your opposite sleeve. Here are my front and back bodice pieces once again opened out at the shoulder seam with the right side of the material facing me. I'm going to take the corresponding sleeve and place it right sides together with the bodice, matching the large dot at the top of the sleeve with the shoulder seam and pinning in place. Also match the notches and the underarms and pin in place. Now we can start pulling the basting stitches at the top of the sleeve so that the sleeve fits the bodice from dot to dot on the arm side. Once the gathers are distributed evenly and everything fits, pin in place. Now we can sew the sleeve to the bodice with a 5/8 inch seam allowance from one side of the underarm to the other side. Repeat to attach both sleeves. I've also gone ahead and finished those sleeve seam allowances together, trimming the fabric to about 3/8 of an inch all the way across as I sewed those finishing stitches. Now that I have the sleeves attached to both sides of the bodice, here is one of my sleeves and a front and back bodice piece. I've gone ahead and finished both sides of the front and back bodice, as well as both sides of the underarm seam, finishing them all separately on both sides of the garment. Now I'm going to place the front and back bodice and their sleeve right sides together and pin the side seams and underarms matching the underarm seam. Doing this on both sides. Now I can sew from the bottom of the sleeve straight across that underarm seam to the bottom of the garment with a 5/8 inch seam allowance and press the seams open for both sides. Fold your cuff piece in half right sides together and pin together at the dots transferred from your pattern piece. Continue pinning along both ends, leaving that center section open. And do this for both cuffs. Then we'll sew from our dots to the bottom corners with a 5/8 inch seam allowance, back stitching at the dots to secure for both cuffs. Then we'll clip from the outer raw edge to each of the small dots, and then trim each of those seam allowances for the portions that we sewed. Then we can turn each of our cuffs right side out, poking out the corners. Press both of the cuffs so that the seam allowances of the center unsewn portion are pressed to the inside. Here is the bottom of one of my sleeves, and I've gone ahead and sewn basting stitches all around the bottom edge, from one side of the slit to the other. Now I'm going to pull those gathering stitches so that the bottom of the sleeve will fit inside of the opening in the cuff. I'm going to tuck the edge of the bottom of the sleeve inside that opening by about 5/8 of an inch. Pin in place so that both tucked in seam allowances of the cuff are aligned with one another. Now that the bottom of the sleeve is gathered and placed in between the folded edges of the open section of the cuff, and we have a clean finish, we're going to edge stitch around the entire perimeter of the cuff. Do this for both cuffs. Here is one of my front skirt pieces, and I've gone ahead and finished both vertical raw edges separately with my serger. And I've done this for both front skirt pieces. I've also finished the raw side edges of my back piece on both sides. Now I'll place the front skirt pieces right sides together with the back skirt and pin those side seams. Doing this to pin both front skirts to the back skirts at the side seam. Then I'll sew both side seams with a 5/8 inch seam allowance and press the seams open. Here is the bottom raw edge of my front and back bodice pieces, opened out at the side seam with the right side of the fabric facing me. I'm going to place the raw top edge of the skirt right sides together with the bottom of the bodice, and I'll pin all the way across from center front to the opposite center front, matching the side seams. Sew all the way across the waistline to attach the bodice to the skirt with a 5/8 inch seam allowance, then finish the raw edges together. Once that waistline seam is sewn, press that seam allowance up toward the bodice. Once we have that seam allowance pressed up toward the bodice, we're going to top stitch from the right side of the garment with a 3/8 inch seam allowance to tack down that seam allowance and create a casing for our elastic. Make sure to leave the vertical edge of that casing open to insert the elastic. I've cut a piece of 1/4 inch wide elastic according to the cutting guide and the pattern instructions. I'm going to attach a safety pin to one end of the elastic and guide it through the casing from one opened end across to the other. Now I've pinned the elastic on both ends to stay inside the casing, and I'm going to sew a couple times on both ends to secure. Now that the waistline has its elastic, we can hem the bottom of the dress. For the bottom of the hem, I'm going to finish the raw edge all the way across, then I'm going to press that finished edge to the wrong side by 1 inch. Now that those bottom edges are finished and pressed to the wrong side, I'm going to edge stitch close to my finishing stitches from one side of the dress all the way across to the other. For my placket, I've interfaced 1/2 from top to bottom. At the ironing board, we're going to fold both of the short ends to the wrong side by 3/8 of an inch. We're also going to fold it once more lengthwise in half wrong sides together so that the raw edges meet. And I've done this to prepare both plackets. I'm also going to open up each placket and fold one of the long vertical edges to the wrong side by 3/8 of an inch so that these folded edges mirror each other. Now I'll place the long unfolded edge of the placket, right sides together with the center front of the dress, placing one of the short folded edges with the dot transferred to the bodice. Pin in place. Continue pinning matching your notches and the bottom of the dress. The short folded edge of the bottom of the placket will also align with the bottom folded edge of the hem. Once we have that pinned, we're going to sew from the top to the bottom of the center front with a 3/8 inch seam allowance. Now that my placket is attached, I'm going to press the seam that we just sewed toward the placket. Once this seam allowance is pressed toward the placket, fold the placket along our pre-pressed lines, the line that we folded down the middle of the placket and the opposite seam allowance that we've pressed to the wrong side. We want that folded seam allowance to just cover the stitching line, encasing all of the raw edges, and will pin in place from the front of the garment. Once we have the placket encasing the raw edges, we're going to sew from the front of the garment, stitching in a rectangle around the entire perimeter of the placket, just as we did to stitch around the cuffs earlier. Repeat all of these steps to attach both plackets. Here is my right placket, and I'm going to mark the buttonholes. And I'll sew each of my buttonholes in place. I've marked where my buttons should go on the opposite placket, and now I'll sew them in place. And now the dress is complete. Thank you for watching this sew along. Subscribe for more full-length sewing tutorials, and I'll see you in the next video.